Welcome to today's special Asia Society Global Program, the Quad in 2022, Dialogue and Disruption. I'm Dominique Fraser. I'm a research associate at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. Today, I'm speaking to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respect to elders past and present. I would also like to acknowledge the Asia Society Australia Board who are convening in Melbourne today. Today's program is pretty exciting. We'll be debriefing on the Quad Leaders Summit in Tokyo, which took place just 2 days ago. It was the first order of business for newly elected Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who prioritised travelling to Tokyo to meet all his fellow Quad members. President Joe Biden from the United States, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. The meeting was also the first visit by US President Joe Biden to the region since taking office, and it was the first in-person Quad leaders meeting since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So China's presence loomed large, of course, but as did issues around climate change, trade, COVID-19, supply chains, and economic and cybersecurity. Echoing the US president, the Quad isn't just a passing fad, and there's no doubt that the grouping is now a significant body in the Indo-Pacific. To dig deeper into the outcomes of this week's summit, we have assembled global expertise from the Asia Society Policy Institute with experts from each of the 4 Quad nations. Joining us from the US is Danny Russel. He is the Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Danny has had an illustrious career as a member of the Senior Foreign Service at the US Department of State, where he served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. From Japan, we're joined by Senior ASPI Fellow, Professor Takako Hikotani. Takako is a professor at Gakushuin University International Center and concurrently a visiting professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, University of California. From Australia, we're joined by Richard Maude, Senior Fellow at ASPI and also Executive Director at Policy at Asia Society Australia. Richard most recently served as Deputy Secretary of the Indo-Pacific Group in the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and as head of the Whole of Government Task Force, which supported the preparation of the Australian Government's 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. And finally, from India, we have Professor Raja Mohan, a Senior Fellow with the Asia Society Policy Institute in Delhi. And he's also a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies. And he was the founding director of Carnegie India in Delhi. And I will be moderating today's discussion. For a full view of the expertise of all of our 4 amazing speakers, please click on the link we're sharing with you. It has all their bios, so please do take a look. It's quite impressive. Throughout our panel discussion, please feel free to submit any questions or comments in the Q&A box below your screen, and we'll try to incorporate these into today's full discussion. Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. Now, I think that's enough for me. We're not here to hear so much from me. I'll now ask each of the panelists how the Quad meeting went from their respective country perspective. Danny, maybe we'll start with you and the United States. This was President Biden's first trip to Asia as president. What issues were on top of his agenda, and what role did Russia's invasion of Ukraine play?
Well, thanks, Dom. It's a pleasure to be here with such illustrious colleagues. Look, I think it was a very productive trip, short but consequential. The fact is that it came in a month that had already seen President Biden hosting the leaders of the ASEAN nations. So it's been a pretty dramatic uptick in investment in the Indo-Pacific. As far as the Quad Summit, I think obviously there were a lot of outcomes on vaccine delivery, on infrastructure, technology, climate, but I would put by far and away the greatest importance on the announcement of the Maritime Domain Awareness Partnership. I think that has really immense potential, and it is a terrific example of how the Quad collectively can meet the real needs of the region, not just serving the interests of the 4 member countries. President Biden, Jake Sullivan are always talking about showing that democracies can deliver. Well, they are delivering here. Just consider for a minute how many South Asian, East Asian, Pacific nations have, huge coastlines, have thousands, tens of thousands, in some cases, millions of square miles of EEZ, maritime space. And I'll tell you, it's just physically impossible to surveil these vast stretches of ocean just using patrol boats or planes. But at the same time, there's a lot to protect, right? There are these, there's undersea wealth that belongs to these countries: fish, oil, gas, minerals. And there's been, for time immemorial, problems with illegal activities, with piracy, with resource exploitation, with smuggling and illegal fishing. So harnessing commercial or satellite capabilities of the 4 countries to conduct sustained monitoring, to be able to track ships and share the data through these fusion centers that are being set up. This is big. And I think also importantly, it serves as a hedge against China's aggressive use of these massive fishing fleets that it deploys and their extensive military militia. If those vessels can be detected, if they can be monitored, then they can be challenged when they operate in the waters of another country. You asked about Ukraine. I think that was certainly an important topic of discussion among the leaders themselves, but only indirectly, I think, is it relevant to the Quad agenda, given the Quad's regional focus. There's also the issue of Taiwan. And, obviously Biden's very clear answer to a question about his willingness to intervene in the event of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, it caused a bit of a stir, and his staff's clarification of his comment may have muddied the waters a little bit more. But Taiwan isn't a direct focus of the Quad. I think the Quad is relevant to Taiwan in that solidarity among the 4 nations certainly shows Beijing that the cost of any military action against Taiwan would be high. And lastly, I'd say that Taiwan is itself relevant to the Quad in the sense that Taiwan and the Quad share many values and contribute to the regions in many of the same ways. So in summary, I think from the U.S. point of view, the Quad capped a very productive month of Indo-Pacific-oriented activities.
Thank you very much, Danny, and I appreciate you anticipating my question on Taiwan. Takako, I think this is a good moment to go to you and Japan's role. So Japan was the host of this meeting and obviously had important bilateral meetings with the United States around the Quad meeting as well. And in that bilateral statement, sort of, the role of certain actors in the South China Sea was mentioned quite strongly, and also, of course, in the Quad statement. So my question to you is, how was the meeting received in Japan, and do you think that the Quad will take on a strong...
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. So as for the Quad meeting, somewhat similar to Danny's point, I think in Japan it was considered to be more of a week or a couple of days of visits. So the Quad meeting, not that it was overshadowed, but it was seen as a series of events that took place in Japan at this moment, because the Quad meeting was preceded by a bilateral in-person summit that Prime Minister Kishida had longed for a very long time. They had only taken place either online, as it was in January, or in the sidelines. But he had wanted this to happen for a very long time. And it was also followed by very important bilateral summit meetings. And it was timed almost perfectly for him to meet with the new Australian Prime Minister Albanese in the most quickest timing possible. And also he was able to follow up with Prime Minister Maude, who Kishida visited in March. So altogether, it was a very efficient, productive line of events. And just for the bilateral, as was mentioned, in some ways, the statement by President Biden on Taiwan kind of overwhelmed the other news to a certain extent. But if there was any attention to this meeting caused by that in the US, I think that might have been actually a good thing, that there was more reporting of the president being in Tokyo. And I think it was important in the sense that the visit, not only in the bilateral meeting, not only confirmed the US-Japan relationship as a cornerstone of the free and open Indo-Pacific, that was very well expected, and Japan committed to strengthen both the deterrence and response capabilities and to increase the Japanese budget for that matter, and for the U.S. to affirm the critical importance of ensuring that the U.S. extended deterrence remains credible and resilient. But I think the new twist that I think is relevant and was a really good bridge in a way to the Quad meeting is that the statement that I see in the joint statement, that Japan and the U.S. as global partners affirm that the rule-based international order is indivisible. Threats to international law and a free and fair economic order anywhere constitute a challenge to our values and interests everywhere. And that's a pretty strong statement that kind of brings the US-Japan alliance to the next level, and also provides some context and meaning to what Japan's efforts have been in supporting Ukraine. And having said that, and also it was what the U.S. mentioned during that meeting about Japan's support for Japan's permanent membership in the United Nations, and also for hosting the G7 summit in Hiroshima, is also very well received. So regarding the summit, regarding the Quad, Quad is one of the most important foreign policy initiatives for Japan. It's a culmination of Japan's strategic initiatives since the first Abe administration back in 2007 about the confluence of the two seas, the Indian Sea and the Pacific Ocean. So it's actually very important. And that and Prime Minister Abe actually had a meeting with Prime Minister Modi in which he kind of emphasized the fact that it was something that started way back from his administration, and that he's very happy with what it has evolved into. And that is to create a region that is free, open, inclusive, healthy, anchored by democratic values, and constrained by coercion. But I think the most simple way to put it as the importance for Japan is to try to have US commitment in the region and to engage India. And that I think is very important. And just the sort of the uptick in the importance of the Quad meeting, not just as an initiative from Japan, but all countries being more interested in the meeting, as seen from the fact that the summit meetings have been happening at the pace that it has been very important. And finally, I think Japan was the perfect host because it was last time was in the US, and Australia seemed to have been very busy at this moment. And I think it might have been a good thing for it to be hosted in Japan, given the differences that with Ukraine happening, that India might have had with other countries. I think Japan might have been sort of an ideal venue for the Quad, and also for the type of pragmatic initiatives that was announced. I think it was very fitting that Japan, being sort of the pragmatist going forward, getting things done one by one, it was sort of a good host for that kind of the direction of the Quad meeting too. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And just on this topic of getting things done, Japan in recent months has been quite strong in, sort of traveling the world and making new defense deals with the UK, Thailand, Australia. Japan has spoken about Ukraine being the next, or East Asia sort of being the next Ukraine. And do you think that Japan will push for the Quad to have more of a defense component, and how would that be received?
I don't really think it's up to Japan to decide. And also it has to do with what exactly the Quad is meant to do together, as well as what the Quad actually is. And I think I think it's not something, what Japan or other countries are aiming towards. It's not an Asian NATO. I think that's pretty clear, that we're not talking about mutual defense commitment in a way of NATO or pooling resources in a way of NATO. And I think it's important to highlight that we do already have alliance arrangements with different countries, so it's not like a same balanced thing. And so it's better not to try to get to the same balanced thing anyway. But I think what's more important coming out of this meeting is what Danny just mentioned about the Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative. I think those kind of pragmatic steps that do contribute to security is important, as well as other issues that was on the agenda, such as cybersecurity and infrastructure, that does create the resilience of the region, and sort of not directly on security focus, but adding the security component in a pragmatic way. I think that is a step forward for Japan on the security side of the Quad.
Thank you very much, Takako. And you mentioned Australia and its new Prime Minister. Richard, of course, our newly sworn in Prime Minister, made a quick dash over to Tokyo. And what sort of agenda does he bring to the Australian government, and what role does the Quad play in that agenda?
Yeah, thanks, Dominique, and lovely to be here with colleagues from the Policy Institute. As you said in your introductory remarks, the timing was very tight. He was sworn in and then more or less literally walked onto the plane. I think in an ideal world, he would have wanted a bit more time, but as it turns out, I think there was actually a good deal of serendipity in being able to get to the Quad meeting. It was an instant immersion for the new Prime Minister in the world of the Quad, a brilliant opportunity to meet the leaders of three of Australia's most important partners and get a sense of their worldview and their current priorities and preoccupations. So in that regard, it actually turned out, I think, very well for Mr. Albanese. What we saw, I think, very strongly was that the Quad will continue to be a very important and prominent part of Australian foreign policy under the new government. In his remarks to the Quad, Mr. Albanese described the Quad as standing together for a free, open and resilient Indo-Pacific region. And he also said that the Quad partnership was needed now more than ever to build a stronger and more cooperative Indo-Pacific region that respects sovereignty. So there is quite a big degree of continuity there with the outgoing Australian government led by Mr. Morrison, and a new government that similarly sees an alignment of interest and values in Australia's participation in the Quad. But in Tokyo, we did also see where some of the differences will be, and climate change is one of them. The new government has committed to take stronger action on climate change. I think it's very notable that in his opening remarks to the Quad, Mr. Albanese referred to the incoming government's commitment to a new midterm target for emissions reductions, a new 2030 target of a 43% cut in emissions, which is significantly more ambitious than the outgoing government. And the new Prime Minister and the new Foreign Minister have also been at pains to stress the importance of that greater ambition on climate change to Australia's standing and influence in the Southwest Pacific. And Mr. Albanese also came to the meeting with a commitment to do more, for Australia to do more in the Southwest Pacific and in Southeast Asia. Now, I should say that the previous government didn't sit on its hands in either region, but the new government comes to power with a critique of the old government's efforts in both Southeast Asia and South Pacific. It's going to increase development assistance. It wants to spend more aid in both regions. In the Southwest Pacific in particular, the new government has a slew of new initiatives that it announced during the election campaign. And I think it's no accident that Penny Wong is leaving for a trip to Fiji today. in her first solo visit as foreign minister. So that's, that I think is the quick takeout from an Australian perspective.
Thank you very much, Richard. And finally, we've got India as the fourth Quad member. Raja, what does the Quad say about the current direction of Indian foreign policy and its relations with the US and China?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be part of a distinguished group of panelists, all my colleagues at Asia Society. I think India has been the critical piece in this whole exercise. The Indo-Pacific was about putting India back into the Pacific. And the Quad is about getting a non-treaty partner, because India is the only non-treaty partner, into a framework of collaboration with the US and its Asian allies. I said putting back because India was very much part of the Pacific till the Second World War, where India withdrew fully under the non-aligned policy from any security role in Pacific or in the Indian Ocean. So we became a lone ranger. What we see today, in the last few months, is that India moving away from its traditional non-aligned role to get closer to the United States. In fact, many in India itself were very hesitant, cautious about engaging the Quad. But today what we've seen is under the Modi government, there's been a steady advance closer to the US, far more purposefully, far more decisively. In fact, Foreign Minister Jai Shankar has written an op-ed today saying the Quad is a natural outcome of the evolution of India's position in the international system and not an aberration from its historic role as non-alignment. So I think it is a decisive, slow but decisive shift to the United States and our Chinese friends with 4 major military dust-ups in the Himalayas, 2013, 2014, 2017, and 2020, have made it rather easier for India to work more closely with the United States and its Asian allies. At the Tokyo summit, I would say the 4 key features from the Indian perspective. One was to manage the differences over Ukraine. We saw that India's reluctance to condemn the Russian invasion has not come in the way of actually doing more in the Indo-Pacific. So my sense is at least India's partners recognize that Russia is about India's past, while we need to look to the future rather than make that a contentious issue. But at the same time, India also, while it was unwilling to mention Russia's name, the underlying principles raised by the Ukraine invasion on territorial sovereignty, integrity, that India was fully endorsed in a ringing way in the statement that came. So no change of status quo in East Asia. That principle has come through strongly, and India is fully on board because India itself is a victim of Chinese attempt at unilaterally changing territorial status quo in the Himalayas. The second, I would say, is on the economic front. India, again, not been an easy partner on trade issues. India walked out of the ASPI in 2019. But I think India is now taking a more strategic look at trade, having argued that it can't be part of a China-led Asian economic architecture. India has now moved in the last few months to negotiate a trade liberalization agreement with Australia, negotiating something with UK, beginning something with the EU. And so this is what India is saying. By joining the IPEF, what India is saying, look, it is ready to take a more strategic approach, a non-China regional framework. It gives India back into the economic engagement in the region because India is not part of the RCEP, India is not part of the APEC. So the IPEF actually provides India a new platform to renew economic engagement. The third is on the technical side. You've seen there is enormous amount of detail out there on technical cooperation. One of them is the agreement to work together on a whole range of critical and emerging technologies. We've done this earlier in the Quad, but I think there's a lot more consolidation of that. And finally, on the security front, where India was squeamish about doing things on the security front, this Maritime Domain Awareness Agreement in the Indo-Pacific actually puts India in a position where it is ready to pool its resources with US, Australia, and Japan on an issue which is a value to the regional countries. And at the same time, also keeps the strategic focus on China. So what this agreement does is that this is not all about geopolitics. This is actually about the four countries working together to help build the capacity of the regional countries and the ability for them to exercise their sovereignty over their own exclusive economic zones. But this will have to be fleshed out. But I think this is a very important step. So I'll conclude by saying India is moving slowly but decisively towards the United States. And notwithstanding the Russia-China exercise you saw during the BRICS, during the summit, India is sitting still in the BRICS. But I think the weight of the Quad, which is an antithesis to the BRICS in some sense, is continuing to grow in India's larger foreign policy calculus.
Thank you very much for this clear and very comprehensive overview of India's foreign policy and the Quad within that. Russel, you mentioned the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, or IPEF. Danny, the US launched this during President Biden's trip together with 12 other countries, including all four Quad members. What are the implications of this new economic framework, and how critical is the Quad to its success?
Well, thanks, Tom. First of all, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework has been launched, more times than a SpaceX rocket. Once in October, once in February, now again in May. But okay, now President Biden himself did the countdown and pressed the button, so that's good. Look, there has been a lot of criticism leveled at the framework that, despite all the fanfare, it's basically just an outline. It's not a trade agreement, certainly, and there are probably more questions in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework so far than there are answers. It's been pointed out that it's pretty unclear what the countries are involved are actually agreeing to, what it's ultimately going to produce. And it's true that a number of the American friends who joined IPEF made no secret of the fact that what they really want is for Washington to join or rejoin TPP or the CPTPP, and to do so before China does. That was pretty clear. But I think the crux of this IPEF, this framework, is really that the Biden administration has now responded to a very strong demand signal from the region that the U.S. put something forward in the economic sphere, start filling what was perceived as a big gap in the Indo-Pacific strategy, and to take some economic initiative. And look, the 12 countries that have signed up, which include the three other Quad members, are the major economies in the region, with the conspicuous exceptions of the mainland China and, of course, of Taiwan. That said, I don't see a solid line, a direct link connecting IPEF and the Quad, the successive one and the successive other. I do think that they have a number of important things in common beyond the membership. They are indeed both focused on getting consensus behind rules that are going to govern behavior in the Indo-Pacific region. The Quad work, as has been mentioned, includes efforts on diversification and securing supply chains, important work on emerging technologies and so on. So there, in that sense, is a bit of an economic dimension. Certainly, each of the Quad members themselves have know what it's like to be on the receiving end of Chinese economic coercion. And some of the goals of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework are, in fact, to reduce China's leverage and to better safeguard countries from that kind of behavior. But I mean, most of all, as Raja pointed out, I think that the fact that India has signed on to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is yet another very encouraging indicator that New Delhi itself is choosing to align more and more closely with Washington, with Tokyo, and with Canberra. So in that sense, I think that the IPEF, although it is different in most respects from the Quad, certainly builds on the progress that has been made through and in the Quad. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Danny, for walking us through IPEF and what it means. Maybe let's bring it back a bit more closely to the Quad again. And Takako, this question is for you. So during Biden's trip to South Korea and Japan, we saw the relationships between those countries really strengthened. And during his campaign trail, new South Korean President Yoon made it quite clear that he would try to make his country join the Quad. How likely do you think it is for the Quad to take on any new members, and how would Japan see the addition of South Korea?
Thank you for that question. I think that's a very important question, and that I think the message from ROK that they're interested in joining is actually a very positive development for Japan and something that Japan should welcome. But I guess the question of what you mean by joining is very something to not for only Japan to think about, but for other Quad countries. That is it talking about Quad turning into a quint of 5 countries, or is it more about Quad plus, or so adding countries in addition to the current Quad? So in what way do we want to transform the Quad to consist of more countries than just 4? Or is it more about having sort of different types of Quad depending on the issue area? And that's something not just for Japan to discuss. And I think for Japan's own matter, I think in terms of ROK's change of government, I think the opportunity for Japan in the realms of security in its relationship with the US and ROK, I think the better forum would be emphasizing the trilateral of US, Japan, and ROK, especially given that I mentioned how the Quad meeting was preceded by the summit meetings and also followed by the summit meetings. It was also followed by missile tests by North Korea that reminded us that that is the security threat that is very grave for us. So thinking about that and the issues that are at stake in Northeast Asia, I think that the more appropriate for us to discuss that for Japan at this moment and what should be prioritized is the trilateral relationship, although I think we should not send a wrong message that we do not welcome ROK's interest in the Quad arrangement as it stands.
Thank you very much, Takako. And with the 2 new leaders in both South Korea and Japan, do you think that trilateral is going to be strengthened in the coming years?
I'm more hopeful than not, but I think it really depends on the domestic politics of each country. And I think for the case of Japan, I think Japan, where the Prime Minister Kishida will be in a stronger position to make more positive developments happen if he wins or goes through the July election, the upper house election, in a very decisive matter. I think that the strength, for domestic politics of ROK is that Prime Minister Kishida might not be seen as too hawkish or have maybe the burden of the history aspect as the previous administrations. And yet in Japan, Prime Minister Kishida has to be careful of those that are more on the conservative end who might be critical to him if he seems to be appear weak on ROK. So for that reason too, I think that the elections will be very important. But I'm hopeful that after the elections, that he will be in a position in which he can make major advances to improve relationship with ROK, because I think experts on both sides are very hopeful that things will turn to the better in terms of the bilateral relationship going forward.
Thank you very much for walking us through that. Raja, of course, China looms large in any discussion around the Quad, whether it's stated or not, but certainly that the joint statement coming out of this week's meeting was fairly strong on China. Again, not stated, of course. And at the same time, President Xi recently declared a global security initiative. For India, to what extent does Quad membership impact its bilateral relations with China?
Look, I think we shouldn't expect the Chinese are going to sit on their hands and do nothing. I mean, so that they had one kind of relationship with the United States, and that relationship has changed. And their own policy was to really, before Quad and the Indo-Pacific came, was to find ways to reduce American presence and role in this part of the world. And that objective has not changed. So my sense is they are going to continuously push. And what we're seeing in the South Pacific, you can say, look, this is where Kurt Campbell, the Indo-Pacific czar, if you will, had said, look, there'll be a strategic surprise. And most probably the strategic surprise is in the South Pacific. And we've seen that happen. So they're going to continue to probe. And they've also talked about expanding the BRICS to bring in a larger number of countries from across the developing world. So I think this is a serious political contestation beyond the geopolitics and military. There is a political contest with increasingly Russia and China on one side and the Quad and the other US and its partners in Europe and Asia on the other. So I think we're just at the beginning of that confrontation, and we'll have to deal with the new initiatives that China is going to come, while at the same time leaving the door open for an engagement with them on eventually there has to be some kind of an accommodation. But at this point, China's objectives in partnership with Russia are to fundamentally change the regional order, both in the Eurasia as well as in the Indo-Pacific. So this is a long-term challenge that will have to be addressed by the regional countries.
Thanks, Raja. Richard, maybe going away a bit from this juicy topic. So as we've heard throughout the discussion today, the Quad meeting has a really, really broad agenda. So it doesn't just look at economic and security matters, but also aims to respond to climate change, to vaccines, emerging technology. To what degree can the Quad achieve all of that? And does it risk losing focus?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dom, because the agenda does well and truly sprawl now. And of course, the Tokyo meeting added to that sprawl. I think I agree with Danny and others who've praised the new Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative, but it's yet another big initiative on the Quad list. There's also a newish coordination mechanism on humanitarian disaster relief. So there is a risk of the Quad trying to do too much and not actually delivering, and therefore damaging its credibility. There is a risk that it will become to be seen about everything but also nothing at the same time, and perhaps also of creeping into areas of cooperation that might actually be better done in larger and more inclusive groups. However, having kind of made that sort of point of caution, I do think there's a strong rationale, a good reason for the current focus of the Quad on things like vaccines and on infrastructure and climate change and the Maritime Security Initiative. At least for the time being, there are significant limits to the Quad's willingness and likelihood of taking on a very significant defence and security agenda. As Takako said, the members of the Quad are careful about the idea that the group will be seen as an Asian NATO. India in particular is cautious about a strong defence pillar of the Quad emerging. So there are natural limits to how far that agenda can be pushed. But I do really think that if your ultimate intent is about balancing China's power, in the Indo-Pacific and also about supporting the resilience and autonomy of the region, then delivering public goods, as the Quad is doing, is one very strong and healthy way to do it. And that's the path that the Quad has chosen. It's no accident that the Quad statement out of Tokyo describes the Quad as, I'm quoting here, a force for good, committed to bringing tangible benefits to the region. It's chosen that path because of the limits on its ability to push hard into a defence agenda or a really hard security agenda, but it's also a path that retains a strategic rationale. And lastly, it's a path that's least alienating to the broader region, particularly in Southeast Asia, where this kind of activity is really seen as adding value.
Richard and Danny, you had your hand up. Was that deliberate? Would you like to add anything?
I was going to add one insight to the series of insights that Richard put forward, but then he scooped me by I was going to say onto his series of very, very just and so I'm good.
Well, unfortunately, I think we have a bit of trouble connecting with you right now, Danny. We also had a question from the audience, which was, why was there a break in Quad activities between until 2017, and is it a different organisation now? Raja, I might get your insights on that.
I think people are not ready in 2007. The Japanese initiative, it was Abe-san's first term as Prime Minister. The official level first meetings took place. I think India was squeamish, Australia was squeamish. The US had many other issues to deal with China, so it didn't really take off. I mean, I think once a Chinese assertiveness had become hard to ignore in the last few years, I think it has got revived. As I said, look, India's ambivalence was shredded when China kept pushing in Ladakh, and 2020, the crisis was one of the most severe we had. So India ended that, and I think India ended its ambiguity and said, look, we're going to go forward with the Quad. I mean, and meanwhile, the trilateral engagement between US, Australia, and Japan had steadily grown. So I think it's come out of, is a consequence. I think our Chinese friends often present it as some kind of a attempt to isolate them, but it's actually a consequence of China's assertiveness on the territorial disputes. For example, India, old Asian solidarity, we love that. We are part of the BRICS, we're part of the non-aligned movement. For us, to move this way would not have been possible or necessary, done what it has done. And I think not just on so I think there is a recognition today in India that the Chinese threat is real and that it needs a balancing structures, and therefore we need to move forward. I'll just say one thing about the military and the civilian. I mean, Quad is not a military forum. I think India was quite clear on that, and that's the reason I think the Trump administration wanted to make it a more military approach. The Biden administration has taken a different approach. I think it's worked well for India, a non-military focus on public goods in the Quad, while initiating other security arrangements. AUKUS, for example, is one of them. And there are other bilaterally, we've seen a lot more going on the defense front between India and the US and Japan, and all the other partners. So the defense part has been moved to the bilateral. And the Quad will focus on non-military aspects. And this gives it, I think, a lot more credibility in the region. And I think that's working well.
Thank you very much, Raja. I hear you on the Quad not being a military forum, and Takako said something similar when she said that it's not going to be an Asian NATO. But as just someone from the audience asked, Danny, to what extent does China see the Quad as a threat? And hopefully we won't lose you again.
The Chinese have demonstrated they regard the Quad as a threat, and it's because not for military reasons, but for geopolitical reasons. You have four very powerful and wealthy nations of Northeast Asia united as democracies and united behind a commitment to a common vision of how global governance should operate. The Chinese have thumbed through the thesaurus and their history books looking for analogies and characterizations of the Quad to denigrate it. It's, an Asian NATO, it's a clique, it's the Gang of Four, and so on. But I think there's no question that the Chinese are deriving some lessons from the degree to which unity is manifest in many, many different formats. The Quad being one obvious and important one, but there really is a proliferation now of coalitions of the willing, of minilaterals or plurilateral arrangements. There's a greater alignment, I think, in response to challenges to universal rights, to global governance, to principles of sovereignty, et cetera. And that is very much the future that I think Xi Jinping did not intend for this decade.
I mean, just add a sentence. I think the Chinese characterization of the Quad as a small clique, I think is a kind of stunning hypocrisy. So my cliques are good, your cliques are bad. So I think it's really completely driven by their own, self. In this Quad wouldn't be where it is, as I said earlier, without the Chinese posing threat to its neighbors. Forget the US. Two of its most important Asian neighbors, that is Japan and India, are locked in territorial disputes. So unlike India, Japan was even more deeply integrated. So I think what China assumption that the neighbors will simply lump it on the US is not going to come to their rescue. That assumption, I think, is what drove them into a set of policies. They seem to be finding it hard to walk back. And I think we got to see that clearly. What is the cause and effect, rather than simply debating things on the Chinese terms, which has been a problem for the last many decades, that somehow the Chinese say, for example, Chinese say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is the problem in Asia. The Five Eyes, the Quad, the AUKUS, the US bilateral alliances, and then the big bad wolf, the US itself. So I think we need to differentiate Chinese propaganda from what is the real concern. And I think for too long, we've tended to debate on Chinese terms, and time has come to set the terms. And this way, I think what the Biden administration has done to define a new discourse rather than simply react and debate on Chinese terms. And I think that's a big shift and a welcome shift.
Thank you, Raja. And also unfortunately, we are slowly coming to an end. So we'll ask the final questions, which will go to all of you and goes to Raja's point of the Quad members now setting the agenda. So thinking of your respective Quad nations, what's something that your country would like to see in order to strengthen the grouping? And we might go in alphabetical order of Quad members. So that's Richard, Raja, Takako, and Danny.
Thanks, Dominique. Look, I think the Quad is actually in rude health. So really, it just has to focus now on delivery, be a little bit disciplined with this agenda, and get things done. So that's my very quick answer. But I might just take 1 minute to cover some of the specific questions that you've got. So somebody asked about was Labor's target climate emissions reduction target big enough for the Southwest Pacific? I think it probably will be. Labor's not, I think, going to bite on a much more ambitious target, but the 43% puts Australia in very good company with like-minded partners. And then there've been a couple of questions about the Quad and how it might approach its agenda in the Pacific. There is a line in the Quad statement about the Quad recognising that it has to individually and collectively, quote unquote, up its effort in the Pacific. And that was even before we've had the leak of this very worrying attempt by China to draw together a multilateral agreement between China and a number of Southwest countries that would cover security cooperation, fishing, climate change and so on. So I think at the end of the day, Australia can't do it on its own. There's going to have to be a lot more engagement by the Quad members and other interested countries, for example, the Europeans, to help out in the Pacific.
If I may just step in, I mean, my sense is the principal strategic objective of the Quad is to offer alternatives. Because for the last 20 years, we believed China's dominance is inevitable, a China-led order is inevitable, and that China is simply stitching the region together, and we have no other choice but to simply accept it, or maybe make marginal adjustments to what China is doing. What we're seeing today is the Quad statement in document, the willingness to offer on infrastructure, on debt management, on technological standards, on 5G. And I think that is the new agenda that has come. Here, we need to offer concrete alternatives, and I think we're just beginning to go down that road. Hopefully, there is more. But I also want to just refer to two questions that have come. One is the question of space and anti-satellite weapons. I mean, that's really truly arms control domain, but space is an important element of the Quad discussions. And anti-satellite weapons is only one part. But as space gets crowded, as more and more economic use of spaces come to the fore, there is a need for a regulatory environment to drawing up new rules beyond the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. To some extent, the US has already begun this process to set up the Artemis Accords to deal with the moon and other objects. So I think there is room here for us to work together to create a new rules of the road. Road is not the right word, for outer space. And I think there's a lot of room for that. On the question of sovereignty, I mean, I think that is the most critical thing. Historically, the US and the West were not associated with the defense of sovereignty in Asia. In fact, the European colonialism was seen as undermining Asian sovereignty. But today, it is the Chinese and Russian imperial projects that threaten the sovereignty of Asian states. And this is where I think the big shift that the Quad, the US, standing together to defend the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Asian states. I think the full meaning of the shift has not been understood. This, I think, gives a powerful ideological position to deal with the Chinese policies in this part of the world.
So I guess alphabetically it's me. Next, I'd just like to add one thing that I like that haven't been covered as part of the Quad, and also one possible suggestion, not representing the Japanese government anyway, but one I like that hasn't been highlighted is a Quad fellowship to encourage graduate students from the 4 countries to study in the US. And that, from somebody who teaches has taught at US universities, that's a really important reversal of policy from the previous administration. And I think these kind of long-term projects are very important. So I like to point out that I think that's important. The other is, I think, in relation to what Richard mentioned about this fraud, what to do about the really good various initiatives going on and as part of the Quad initiative, and whether or not we need some kind of a secretariat to manage that, or what needs to be done rather than just a rotating basis for these kind of meetings, which does create a momentum. But I guess the downside of that might be that functionally, depending on what initiative, it might be better to have a different type of arrangement for progress to be made. So how exactly to measure or to have a benchmark for success, and also how to move it forward without just being like announcements, because it is multiplying. And you do wonder how exactly we're going to follow up with what's been promised at the summit, but which is all very well intended, but we need to see how it goes. So that's my take. Thank you.
Well, in terms of what would strengthen the Quad, which has been phenomenally creative and I think ambitious in its reincarnation as the Quad 2.0 under Biden. Look, it's really time now for the Quad, as both Richard and Raja have indicated, to shift from creating working groups to actually delivering results. It's understandable that, in its first year after the reboot, there's a certain amount of startup mode, and I do think it's been an impressive startup, but this is the year when it ought to be possible to begin harvesting some of the outcomes from the various working groups in ways that are visible to the other countries. And the Indo-Pacific region who stand to benefit from the various deliverables. One question in the chat directed at me is what happens when countries see and get the information about, say, Chinese flotillas in their exclusive economic zone. I'd simply say that seeing the problem is a precondition for being able to address it. And it's never a good thing to be on the losing end of the surprise factor as a foreign policy or national security actor. How the countries are going to respond to Chinese behavior is a different question, and that's obviously going to vary country by country, situation by situation. But you don't have to look any further than China's own domestic surveillance system to recognize the fact that when people or countries understand that they are being observed, that they are being watched, it can in many cases have a somewhat salutary effect on their behavior. So if nothing else, this Maritime Domain Awareness Project is a start. Back to you, Dom.
Thank you very much, Danny, and thank you to all of our 4 amazing panelists. I think that was an amazing discussion, very insightful, and I believe that at least from the 4 of you, there is definitely a mandate for the court to implement its goals.